Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome John Williams, private economic consultant and the publisher of the Shadow Stats newsletter. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
John, the Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics just finished telling us that the private market has an important role to play gathering economic statistics and analyzing the data that gets presented, sometimes using assumptions that may be different from those used by government analysts. I asked you on because that's what you do at Shadow Stats, going behind and beyond government economic reporting while recalculating many of the headline numbers that move markets. Before we dig in, tell us a bit about yourself. You've been chasing numbers for a long time.
Well, I've been a private consulting economist since the early 1980s. I found early on that I really had to have a pretty good understanding of what really was in the government numbers if I ever wanted to have a hope of meaningfully forecasting where things were going, which is the information I provided to my customers. What I found was that over time that there had been biases built into the headline numbers, the economic numbers on the upside, the inflation numbers to the downside, that they were structural in nature, generally very deliberate in nature, and that over time what was happening with economic statistics moved away from common experience and what people thought was happening.
Yeah, I'd like to focus on two measures that markets watch, the Consumer Price Index and the headline unemployment rate. Let's start with the CPI. How does today's CPI differ from the cost of living index that used to be published back in the 70s?
Well, the CPI, the whole concept of a consumer price index, and this goes back literally centuries, was to give people a way of measuring the change of a cost of living based on a constant standard of living. Your basket of goods would be fixed. A real simplistic approach. They'd say price out a pound of steak, a gallon of gas, a loaf of bread. In 1 year, they'd price out that same stuff the next year. However much that basket of goods had gone up in value, that was your rate of inflation. Back in the 90s, though, and they'd actually started changing numbers around before the 90s, back in the 80s. But in the 90s, the Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, Michael Boskin, who is head of the Council of Economic Advisors, started making a lot of noise about how the CPI, the Consumer Price Index that was published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, overstated inflation. And if you ask them, what do you mean it overstates inflation? They'd say, well, suppose the price of steak gets too expensive. People will buy more hamburger or they'll buy more chicken. And if they do that, their cost of living isn't as high. Well, that's true. In concept, that's not maintaining a constant standard of living. The CPI was intended for the individual to look at a constant standard of living. If you're looking at the CPI as a way of measuring what you need in the way of an income increase or what kind of targets you're using with your investments, you want to be able to live at least as well as you did the year before.
Well, here's what confuses me about this substitution game when you're calculating the CPI. If you consistently remove commodities that get more expensive and replace them in your CPI basket with cheaper products because that's how consumers respond, can't you contrive to report zero inflation even though we all end up eating gruel?
Yes, and that's exactly what's happening because the government, as a result of its 1990s initiative, started moving the headline CPI to a substitution basis with the effect of actually lowering the rate of inflation from what it would have been otherwise. They never made it a fully substitution-based index. They've created a new index called the Chainweighted CPI, which you're eventually going to use and plug in there as the factor for adjusting cost of living, let's say, for Social Security. Mm-hmm. And that's what Greenspan was looking for. He said, boy, if we only had a more accurate CPI that would give you a lower rate of inflation, we could cut back on cost of living adjustments, and that would help us balance the deficit. It also pushed people artificially into higher tax brackets. So what they did with the numbers and what the changes that they've made to the CPI have not been for the advantage of giving people more accurate inflation numbers the way they want inflation covered in terms of their income or their investments. What the government's given us is a number that is the lowest inflation number that they can come up with in the way of calculations that will help them minimize the budget deficit without anyone in Congress having to vote against Social Security.
I mean, it gets even more confusing. I was talking to the commissioner about this hedonic adjustment game, and I'm reflecting on it. Any product that follows Moore's law gets better, faster, and cheaper over time. And it's not just electronics. I mean, any manufactured product that enjoys innovation and scale efficiency will get better and cheaper. This has everything to do with products and almost nothing to do with the purchasing power of money. So how can a price basket that includes these kind of products be used to estimate the erosion in the value of the dollar without introducing subjective judgments?
It can't. And that's a big problem. To give you an example, very straightforward, no great theoretical involvement here other than what's a quality adjustment. Mm-hmm. And it was so egregious that the Bureau of Labor Statistics eventually backed off it. But some years back, the government mandated a new formulation of gasoline to improve air quality. And when the mandate went into effect, gasoline prices jumped by 10 cents a gallon. That was a big increase at the time. Mm-hmm. But it didn't show up in the Consumer Price Index. The reason being the government deemed it to be a quality improvement, and therefore it didn't affect the CPI. But the average guy who was filling a tank of gas to go to work was moaning and groaning that he had to pay more out of pocket for his gasoline. He was not celebrating that he was going to have cleaner air. That particular incident has been reversed out of the numbers. But you take the case of a computer. Now, there are very legitimate questions in terms of what a product can do over time, particularly as technology advances. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the element of the out-of-pocket. Simple example from my end. 5 years ago, and I'm not high-tech, I bought a new computer. I use it for word processing, for working with my numbers, doing my charts and such. Cost me $1,000. I was replacing a computer I'd bought 10 years before that for $1,000. Okay, my out-of-pocket on that hadn't changed. That's the way I viewed it. But the way the government looked at it, because the memory is so much greater, all sorts of things. I should have been able to buy what I bought 10 years ago if I wanted to buy that for $50. Couldn't buy that. I had to buy it with all the new features. So that from the standpoint of looking at a CPI that is based on these hedonic quality adjustments, from an out-of-pocket standpoint, it came nowhere close to what I actually spent for it the way I would view it. And I think most people want to know what they need out of pocket to cover their expenses, particularly where they don't have an option in terms of buying the older type product that perhaps is perfectly adequate for them.
So the BLS currently estimates the annual inflation rate to be something around 1%. What's your estimate?
Well, their current estimate right now is indeed 1%. If you look at the changes that the government has made over time, and I've looked at all the changes that they've made in methodology, in the hedonics and the substitution effects, some things they don't consider methodology, like more frequently weighting the index. They reweight the CPI every 2 years now instead of every 10 years. That has a substitution effect. It's somewhere between 3.5% to 5% above whatever the government's reporting.
Wow. So if you compound that difference over time, the difference between the official government inflation estimates and your shadow stats estimates, how far apart are we cumulatively in the purchasing power of a dollar over the past couple of decades?
It's a horrendous differential, but even as published by the government, you can look at the median household income, and it's at a 10-year low. This is as published by the Census Bureau. And if you put my numbers in there, yeah, we're still at a 10-year low. The problem is that even with the headline numbers, income is not growing. That's a big problem.
And what about GDP growth?
Well, that's where you have another element, and a very big element, because the way the government looks at economic statistics is they're adjusted for inflation. If you look at retail sales, for example, and retail sales are up by 5%, you could say, boy, that's a good, strong number. But if you look at it, and it's because inflation is up by 5%, prices have gone up by 5%, you really haven't sold any more goods than you did before. Your sales are up because of higher inflation. The principles here do flow through in those areas. They're not all the same numbers. But in terms of, take the GDP, for example, if you adjusted the GDP for elements that I think appropriately should be knocked out that have been changed, what you'll find is that instead of having the economy collapsing into 2009, which is what the government currently shows, and then rebounding after July 2009, where the gross domestic product, now this is the broadest measure adjusted for inflation, is 10% above its pre-recession high. If you adjust for about 2 percentage points of understated inflation, which is what I'm estimating there, you'll find that the economy plunged into 2009, and then you might have had a little bit of a bounce up, but basically it's been stagnant at a low level since, and it's turning down again. That's common experience.
John, let's move on to unemployment. The headline numbers say the economy has recovered to what used to be called full employment, basically an unemployment rate around 4 or 5%. And yet the labor force participation rate has plunged to levels we haven't seen in 40 years. What impact has this had on the way we measure unemployment?
Well, unemployment's a matter of definition. The way the headline number goes, the numbers you see published in the press, the unemployment very simply is the number of people who are unemployed divided by the labor force, which is the total of the unemployed and the employed. The question is how you define the unemployed. The headline number, you have to be out of work, you have to have been able and ready to work and looking for work in the last 4 weeks. Assuming you did that, you're counted as unemployed. But let's say you've been unemployed now for a year and you're not finding any jobs, you don't think there are any available, you want to work, but you give up looking for work. And when you're surveyed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you indicate, well, I haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks. They will then move you into a different category. You're no longer in the headline labor force.
Doesn't it eventually catch up in what they call a U6 number? Doesn't that catch everybody?
The government puts out 6 levels. The U3 is a headline. The U6 is their broadest measure. And if you haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks, but you have looked for work in the last year, they consider you a discouraged worker or marginally attached. They'll add you into that U6 number along with people who are employed part-time for what they call economic reasons. These are people who would like full-time employment, but they can't find it, so they're working part-time. So that U6 number is a lot broader. That's up around 10%, where the headline number is down around 5%. It's at 4.7 at the last reporting.
And how do you estimate U6?
Well, U6, I think they estimate U6 appropriately. And the problem is that after a year, those who are discouraged workers move out of U6. They're no longer counted in U6. Being in the labor force is a very important number. May unemployment dropped from 5% to 4.7%. And normally you'd say, oh, that's wonderful. But if the number of unemployed shrinks and they disappear from the labor force, which is what happened last month, that's not good news because they're not getting the jobs. Whether they're being counted as discouraged workers or just somehow disappearing from the surveys, there's a lot of inconsistency in the month-to-month numbers in the surveys, which raises some issues. The point is that you can, and what you've seen happen very frequently here, in the declining headline unemployment rate, what's supposed to be good news is really bad news because people have been giving up looking for work. They're dropping out of the labor force, and that's reducing the unemployment rate as opposed to going out and finding a job.
So looking at how the BLS counts the total number of jobs, the commissioner talked about what used to be called a bias factor, since renamed the birth-death model, which artificially adds something like 160,000 jobs a month to the payroll numbers. What's the history of that?
I've been in this business since the days of Ronald Reagan. I followed the numbers closely. I talked with people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I've always found that people I've talked with very cooperative, informative. Back in the mid-'80s, there were some funny things happening with the numbers, and I talked with a person there who's handling that specific number, and as it was explained to me, the Bureau of Labor Statistics had added an upside bias factor into their monthly employment estimates. And I asked them why they had done that. They said, well, it was really a matter of preventing political embarrassment. We had a circumstance where we actually underestimated the growth in employment coming out of the 1983 recession, where it's okay politically to overstate employment growth. It's not to understate employment growth. So we had to correct that. We didn't want to miss this jobs growth because everyone's looking for the jobs growth. So they added in something like 160,000 jobs a month. And then they'd adjusted every quarter. And over time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics received some criticism for this. How do you justify this? So they redefined it, and it's now, with all sorts of definitions and highfalutin modeling, known as a birth-death model. It's the same thing. It's a little more fancy in its calculation. The BLS will contend that there are always more jobs created by startup companies and people losing jobs from companies shutting down. And where that may be true in a normal economy, what people tend to forget is that we've just been through, and I'll contend we're still in, the sharpest economic contraction anyone has seen in a long time, decades. That has thrown off all the normal methods of calculating the numbers here, ranging from making assumptions about birth of companies and deaths of companies, seasonal adjustments. Nothing is working as it used to, and you're getting all sorts of distortions in the numbers.
But with all the estimates and fudge factors and changes, doesn't everything eventually get reconciled? Shouldn't the payroll survey and household surveys eventually converge after all the dust settles?
They've tried to reconcile them, and they'll usually come in within about 1 million jobs. Part of the issue has to do with they keep changing the population counts. They revise those every year, and that makes the numbers not comparable in the household survey as you go from December to January. There are a variety of complications, but the best you can look at it, as I see it, is their best estimate, a best guess. But the margins of error are generally worse than they'll tell you. They'll tell you that around the unemployment rate, the 90% confidence interval or 95% confidence interval will be plus or minus 0.2%. The press goes to down over a change of 0.1%, which is the incremental change. They could give you more accurate numbers if they wanted to, but the published numbers are not seasonally adjusted on a consistent basis.
So what about these seasonally adjustments? They're often larger than the actual month-to-month job change numbers.
Of course they are, because you have very significant seasonal patterns. I mean, if you're looking at the jobs market, just think of what happens at the end of the school year. Kids go into the market for part-time jobs. Teachers lose their jobs as teachers. They do various things. Then in the fall, the whole cycle reverses. Around Christmas time, holiday season, retail stores hire. Then after the holiday season, they fire. Big seasonal swings.
There should be a good historical record to sort all that out, shouldn't there be?
Well, there is, and it used to be done that way on a fairly regular basis. Seasonal adjustment is a normal part of the process. It used to be reasonably stable. So what they do is they'd look at, let's say, the last 5 years of data, come up with their estimates of what was seasonal, and apply that for the next 6 months or the next year, and set the seasonal factors in advance. Mm-hmm. What they found was, and this is back in the more stable times of the mid-2000s, that, if you actually recalculated the seasonal adjustments each month using the most recent month's data, you actually got a slightly more accurate number. Okay, that's the way they want to do it. That's fine. Problem is that you should publish your numbers on a consistent basis. What they found was we're going to revise the numbers each month. The unemployment number this month is based solely on the seasonal factors calculated at this month. Although we have the numbers available, we're not going to revise the prior history now. So that the May's unemployment rate that dropped to 4.7% from 5% the month before, the 5% was the seasonally adjusted number for May based on May. The 4.7% was the seasonally adjusted April based on April. Now that might have changed May. Maybe May dropped to 4.8% in revision there, so it was only an improvement of 0.1%. You don't know because they don't publish the number. They don't want to confuse people. It complicates their press releases. Those are the explanations they've given. At the end of the year, they restate everything once back in time where the numbers are consistent. They're consistent for 1 month. And then the next month, they're all thrown off again because the next month's numbers, all the numbers are seasonally adjusted going back in time. There's no consistency. They can be consistent. All they have to do is publish the numbers. They have the numbers. They do the same thing with the payroll survey, month-to-month change in payrolls. But there, they at least publish the current month, the month before, and the month before that in terms of level on a consistent basis, using the same seasonal adjustments that have just been recalculated. But if you look at their press release, that second month back, the month-to-month change there is not as they advertise. That's not consistent. And that can vary by as much as 100,000 month to month because they're not publishing the consistent numbers.
John, it all sounds very complicated when you dive that deep into the details. What advice do you have for market watchers trying to make sense of all the statistics economists throw at them, both from government agencies and from private analysts like yourself?
Read the fine print in the releases. Usually when the government's done something a little funny, like not publishing the numbers on a consistent basis, they'll have it in their footnotes there somewhere so that you can pick up the differences. But what has happened over time, generally, there have been upside biases built into the economic numbers showing stronger economy than reality. And the inflation numbers has an increasing bias over time. And what I found is that Main Street USA has a pretty good sense of what's going on. I look at surveys all the time there. You look at elections and such and what people think of the economy. The average guy knows what's going on. If you don't believe the government's number, if you think inflation is, the reporting is too low, or that the economy is, the reporting is too strong, you're probably right.
John, I appreciate you giving us that outsider's view. Thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was John Williams, private economic consultant and the publisher of the ShadowStats newsletter, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on iTunes or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. Ahead, we'll speak with Jerry Jordan, past president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and the author of The New Monetary Framework. Stay tuned.